Hey guys, we've been getting a bunch of questions recently about what happens when you plug a port on your speaker. So we wanted to kind of cover that because sometimes we suggest to people that that's a good place to start if you think the bass is a little too strong in your room. But there seems to be some confusion on what it actually does to your speaker and even whether it can damage your speaker or not. So let's start with what a port plug is and what it actually does to your speaker. So if you've noticed over the last 10 to 15 years or so, this has become a more common thing to include with a speaker when you buy it is some type of port plug. And there are really two types. One is using some type of open cell foam, which allows some air to pass through it. And the other is a closed cell foam or some type of plastic insert that completely blocks the port. So when you look at the two different types, there's two different things that are happening. The goal of a port plug is to reduce the port or eliminate the port output. So you are reducing some of the bass extension. And the reason why you might want to do this is that in certain rooms, so small rooms or times when you have to place the speaker up closer to a wall, you may want to reduce the bass output because it may be a little too strong in your room. Now, I will say that when you place a speaker up against the wall, you're increasing more than just the area in the port output. So pushing a speaker up against the wall increases bass and lower mid-range, not just down at the port frequencies where it's operating around 30 to 50 hertz or so. So that may not solve your problems, but it should help, especially in smaller rooms where sometimes a port that's tuned low can just add a little bit too much with the room gain. If you're in like a bedroom size room, a ported system that plays down to 40 hertz or so flat may just be a little too much. So these port plugs, you put them in your port and it will either reduce some of the output or completely eliminate the port output. And what that does is it changes the roll off and it makes it closer to or like a sealed box if it's completely plugging it. So now that we know what a port plug is and what it does, let's talk about the second question that often comes up, and that's, will it damage my speaker if I plug my port? And I think part of the confusion about this comes from the fact that some manufacturers send plugs with their speakers or port plugs with their speakers, and some manufacturers don't. So especially with people that didn't have a port plug to begin with, I found that they often get worried that they're going to break something if they plug the port. So when we look at thermal damage, when you convert a speaker from ported to sealed, you do lose some airflow. So there is some air movement from the port that cools the inside of the speaker. But in a home environment, this isn't really a big deal. In pro audio, this is often important, and because they're handling so much power for such long periods of time, they need that airflow from a port. But in a home environment, we're typically listening at only a couple watts at a time under most circumstances. So you're not really going to change how much thermal or increase the risk of thermal damage from your speaker. Now, talking about mechanical damage, that's a little bit of a different story. So when we look at a ported speaker, get a standard 6-inch woofer in a ported box tuned to about 40 to 45 hertz with an input power of 30 watts. Now, when you have a ported system, that when the port output is at its maximum, the woofer excursion is at its minimum, basically. So you're going to see a big dip in the excursion requirements of the woofer right around the port output. So at 40 hertz, we have very, very minimal excursion. Now, once we move below that port tuning, the box doesn't provide any restorative force on the woofer. So the woofer moves around a lot more wildly than you would see in a sealed box. So this is where some of the damage can occur in a ported speaker. So if you drive a ported speaker too hard with deep bass notes, you'll see the cone moves pretty wildly, and you can actually cause mechanical damage in a ported speaker this way. Now, when you switch this to a sealed speaker, so we plug the port, keep the box size the same, you're going to see that excursion below that 40 to 45 hertz is dramatically reduced. So it's controlled a lot better because the pressure inside the box is kind of pushing against the cone of the woofer and keeping it from being able to move as much. What changes, though, is that at that 40 to 45 hertz, your excursion on the woofer is going to be a lot higher now. So when we talk about mechanical damage, it's kind of a little bit of a, it depends on the situation, right? It depends on where the strongest signal from the music is, how loud you're listening to it. So at 45 hertz, if you played a 45 hertz tone or a 40 hertz tone on that ported speaker, you could play it a lot louder without damage, and you would actually start to run into thermal problems before you do mechanical problems. On the sealed speaker, because the woofer is making all of that 40 hertz output, the excursion is a lot higher at 40 hertz versus the ported. But then again, once we move below, the sealed looks a lot better. So when we talk about mechanical damage, it's kind of, again, it's going to depend a little bit on how loud you listen to your music and what frequencies are being played through the speaker at the time. If it was all above, say, 80 hertz, you're really not going to see any difference or any increased chance of damage between the two, the sealed or the ported. So the last question we usually get asked around this is, does this affect my maximum SPL at all? And that's kind of a complex answer. So I'll start with it depends, and we'll talk about why that occurs. But to start with, we're going to ignore everything above the bass region, because when you port or when you plug your port on your speaker, you're only affecting those bass frequencies. So everything in the, from the lower mid-range on up to the top end is not changed at all, and it doesn't affect your maximum output at all. When we look at the bass region, though, it's a complex answer, and it's complex because I'm going to go back to those graphs that we showed earlier between the ported and sealed design. The excursion requirements on the woofer are partially going to dictate what the maximum SPL is going to be there. So if we looked at, say, 40 hertz, where the box is tuned to, that region that has really high port output in the ported design, not only does it already have more, with just a 1 watt signal, it'll have more output at 40 hertz and less cone excursion. But because the cone excursion is minimized there, if you were playing a 40 hertz sine wave, you're going to be able to turn the volume up louder on the ported design before you reach a mechanical limit like you would with the sealed design. Now, eventually you'll reach port chuffing or a thermal limit on your speaker in the ported design, but you would likely get much more SPL out of the ported design right at 40 hertz. When we look at frequencies outside of that, though, it changes a little bit. Again, if we go below the port tuning, the cone excursion on the woofer gets pretty dramatic, pretty high very fast. And that cone excursion is really going to limit how much SPL you can get. On top of that, you've got a sharper roll-off below tuning frequency with a ported design than you do with the sealed design. So the sealed design below the port tuning frequency is probably going to have a lot more actual SPL capability. So in the end, it's kind of a trade-off. And so let's wrap up really quickly the three things that we talked about. So first, when you plug your port, basically you're converting your speaker to a sealed design, or at least something closer to a sealed design if it's not completely blocking the airflow of the port. So what you're doing is changing the roll-off of the bass response and making it closer to a sealed box roll-off, which can change the integration with your room. Second, can you damage your speaker when you do this? Not really. Like, it's safe to plug any port on any speaker, and if your speaker didn't come with a port, you can just stuff anything inside it that will seal it up. A black sock works really well because it usually matches the color of the port. And then lastly, does it change how much SPL you get out of your speaker? And that's a kind of an it depends answer, because again, it's going to drastically depend on what frequency content we're talking about as to whether you get more or less SPL in one version or the other. So I hope that answered all the questions you had about plugging a port on your speaker. If you've got more out there, leave us a comment. We'll try and answer it. But if you like the video, make sure that you hit the like button, and if you want to see more content like this from us, subscribe to our channel. We're going to keep putting out more and more videos. If you have other questions that you want answered, leave us a note in the comments as well, and we can work on a future video about those questions. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you again soon.